So good afternoon. I'm Dudley Reynolds. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Education here at CMUQ, and I'm representing Dean Michael Trick today, who is currently on his way to Pittsburgh and sends his regrets that he couldn't be here. Our lecture today is the A. Nico Haberman Distinguished Lecture. Dr. Haberman was a pioneer of computer science at Carnegie Mellon and founding dean of CMU's School of Computer Science, which is, as you know, a world leader in AI research. Professor Norman Sadeh, our speaker today, is a professor in the School of Computer Science and the co-founder and co-director of CMU's Privacy Engineering program. He served as lead principal investigator on two of the largest U.S. research projects in privacy, the Usable Privacy Project and the Personalized Privacy Assistant Project. He's also the founding CEO of Wombat Security Technologies, a company that defined the multi-billion-dollar user-oriented cybersecurity market. I apologize for the lateness of our start today, and I assure you that it was not Dr. Sadeh's problem. It was a snafu at the airport. He has graciously agreed to kind of shorten and abbreviate his talk and what he'd planned to share with us today. We may not have much time for question and answer at the end, but we are going to try, hopefully, and get an introduction to some of his work. And so with that, I'm going to just sit down and be quiet.
Well, thank you so much for this kind introduction. I'm going to turn on the right microphone, and hopefully we're going to mute that. Okay, thank you. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And Nico Haberman was actually head of department when I was doing my PhD way back when. We're not going to go back there today. But it's a pleasure to be here. I believe this talk was scheduled at 1 o'clock. It's 2 o'clock, so thank you for staying. This is true commitment, so I hope I will not disappoint you. And what I would like to do today, just to warm you up a little bit, and let me see if I can get this clicker to go. So I'd like to try maybe to start with a quick show of hands to see if we, can perhaps motivate a bit more this presentation here. So I'd like to see how many of you have used the same password for more than one system. Yes, you can, but not clear that they're necessarily videotaping you. So thank you for answering that question. And let's do a couple more. So how many of you have read the full text of a privacy policy over the past month? You can lie, but the next question is, did you understand what you read? And that would be a tough one, right? And let's do one more here just to illustrate this. So how many of you have reviewed the privacy settings of the mobile apps on their phones recently, like over the past week? All right, okay. Last week, okay, so at some point, right? So the truth is that when you look at cybersecurity today, as you know, every year the statistics are worse. I mean, it's estimated that cybersecurity costs the world economy between $1 and $10 trillion. So that's pretty significant if you think that the world economy is worth probably about $100 trillion. And about 90 to 95% of the time, when there is some kind of an incident, you can trace it back to some form of human error. So this is how important the human element in cybersecurity is. But it's often been overlooked. And the next step is to think about perhaps this picture and see whether you see something wrong with what's going on in this picture. Anybody? If this were your kid, you'd be happy? Go ahead.
A small kid, assuming he have been holding a phone.
Yes, and what else is going on? It's not good for them to do that in the first place, but he's doing something else at the same time. Walking the street. Right, crossing the street. So there is danger, but he seems to be pretty oblivious to it. And this is very typical of cybersecurity. So cybersecurity, just like privacy, which I'm going to talk about, I'll talk about both today, are known to be secondary tasks. That means that the decisions that you make with regard to security or privacy are made in context where something else is your primary task. So the primary task of this kid is obviously to look at social media posts on his cell phone. And the secondary task is one that is completely ignored. And this is why so many people are basically responsible for those cybersecurity attacks and all these breaches and incidents that I was talking about. And so when you look at the Internet of Things and AI, it's only exacerbating this situation, right? Why? Because IoT, without spending too much time on that, is a bunch of different resources and systems that collect data about us. They give rise to new usage scenarios. They give rise to many more possible attacks. This is called the attack surface in cybersecurity. And the data flows that they give rise to are increasingly complex as well. And the same is true for AI, right? So AI is obviously extremely challenging from a security standpoint. If you look at today's LLMs, they can be hacked. It's understood that that's the case. They give rise to a variety of new types of attacks that can much more easily be automated. Phishing attacks, for instance, deep fakes, right? All these things are actually being used by cyber criminals today. And from a privacy standpoint, good luck trying to determine whether or not an LLM, a foundation model, has information about you and whether that information may not potentially, be the source of a hallucination. There are professors who've had allegations made about them by LLMs with full confidence, allegations that were completely false about them engaging in all sorts of activities that are not appropriate. And so that's the world that we're talking about. That's the world that we're living in today. And so the work that I'm going to talk about over the next maybe 35 minutes or so is work that has attempted to overcome these challenges. So how can we somehow develop technologies that are going to better align with what we human beings are capable of, right? And so for a long, long time, if you look at cybersecurity in particular, technologies were developed that made highly unrealistic assumptions about people. If you look at privacy policies, privacy laws, they're making highly unrealistic assumptions about what you're going to be doing, such as reading those privacy policies or configuring all these settings on your smartphone. So how do we overcome these challenges is the question that my group and I have been trying to address for many years, and with some success. So we'll start with privacy, and then we'll move on to security. So for those of you who don't think about privacy very often, you can sort of summarize privacy, and obviously I could spend a whole hour talking about privacy. But for the purpose of this lecture today, you can think of privacy, information privacy in particular, as the ability to control what data about you is being collected. And so this definition goes back to Alan Westin, who was a professor at Columbia in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and who introduced this notion. This notion has now been formalized in the context of fair information practices principles that themselves have evolved, and they're often referred to as notice and choice. And so the basic idea is that for people to have a modicum of privacy, we need to make sure that they have some awareness of what data about them is being collected, some information is provided to them. That's the notice part. That's that privacy policy. That's the purpose of that privacy policy. And they have some controls. The ability perhaps to restrict at some level the data that's being collected about them, the ability to potentially also restrict how that data is going to be used, right? So that's the choice side. Now, if you look at laws around the world, they're very different, but all of them have those principles embedded in them, subject to very different interpretations. So if you go and look at what people do in Europe, you're going to find one very strict interpretation that typically requires consent up front. It's referred to as opt-in. That means you cannot engage in some practices until you have and unless you have consent from the data subject, the users whose data is being collected. In the US, for instance, we tend to rely much more on an opt-out regime. That in other data opt-out regimes, such as in California, for instance, you can engage in various practices until the data subject, the user, the person whose data is being collected says, please stop, no, right? And in Pennsylvania, we don't necessarily have as many of these protections as people have in Pennsylvania. So the question obviously is, who reads those privacy policies? And as we've seen, you can sort of summarize this only in fantasy land, right? Do people read privacy policies? A colleague of mine did a study way back when about how much time people would have to spend just reading the privacy policies of websites that they access during the course of the year. And the answer was about 2 to 3 months of their time would have to be dedicated just reading the text of these privacy policies. And that doesn't even assume that those privacy policies might change during the course of the year. that only looks at the websites, and it assumes that people would actually understand what they've read, which is typically not the case either, right? And if you think about those privacy settings, a typical user, I don't have the time to do a show of hands, but a typical user, and hopefully you'll be able to relate to this, today has between 50 and 100 apps on their smartphones. And if you look at how many privacy settings that translates into, that's between 100 and 200 different settings that you would have to spend time looking at. And so it's very clear that even though these regulations that we have are useful, they're helping in some fashion, they're really highly unrealistic in terms of how people are going to be able to take advantage of them. And so the work that we've done over the years has really aimed to overcome that. And so back in 2012, 2013, we pioneered the use of natural language processing techniques and machine learning techniques to automatically read the text of privacy policies and extract statements from those privacy policies with a fairly high level of accuracy. Today, we're obviously using LLMs, and actually over time, we sort of move towards that, and I'll say a few words perhaps about LLMs if we have time. But we've been quite successful. We really pioneered this space, and these are just a bunch of different examples with color codes showing you how you can look at the text of a privacy policy and extract a variety of different statements. I don't have the time to go into that, but we're sort of the pioneers in this space, as I've mentioned, and have made quite a bit of progress. You might say, okay, that sounds great, but at the end of the day, what do you do with that? Oh, and I like to show this slide because we got a lot of press coverage for this work over the years. I like this one. This was an article in Fast Company. The lower part of the screen here is the article talking about our research. It just so happens that this magazine had also updated its privacy policy and was displaying a banner that said that they had a new privacy policy. So it was actually quite ironic to see the juxtaposition of both of those things on the same page. So what about building, tools? So, having technology that can actually read the text of these privacy policies sounds great, but what do you do with that? And so we've built a bunch of different tools over the years. And so examples of tools that we've built were tools, for instance, to automatically look at the text of privacy policies and look at the opt-outs. That means the options that are being provided to people to say, please stop engaging in this practice, please stop collecting this data, please stop sharing this data. These opt-outs are mandated by law, but often these laws do not require these opt-outs to be very prominent. And so if you're the website operator, you're going to be very tempted to hide these, to say, they are there, believe me, I've checked that box, but nobody's ever going to find those opt-outs, and nobody's going to take advantage of that. But if we develop technology that can automatically find these opt-outs and then expose them to users, then we're making a big difference. And so that's the tool that we build. This is one of the many tools that we've built over the years. It's called Opt-Out Easy. And since I've been speaking for a long time, maybe I'll just briefly play a video for you. Let's see if the sound works here. And I probably don't have actually internet access at this point. Or do I? We're at CMU, right? So I'm probably on the network. Let's find out. I'm not on the network right now. Maybe we can arrange that. So CMU Q Secure, or should I do EduRoam? EduRoam, let's try EduRoam. That should work right away. No panic. We're going to get there. Okay. Because this is actually not my laptop. This is a laptop I've borrowed. Could you connect me potentially? Thank you. And so, and we can skip that slide in the meantime. We'll get back to it. So that's an example of a tool. Let me tell you about other tools that we've developed over the years. So another thing that we came to realize, so this worked very nicely. It's been available as a Chrome extension for a number of years at this point. And so as you browse the web, this thing will actually pop up various types of choices that are available to you so that you don't have to go and read that privacy policy and discover that these choices are available. But there are lots of other things that you can do. One thing that we really got very interested in after a while was to see whether we could also automatically identify compliance issues with, for instance, mobile apps, right? So mobile apps are developed by typically two guys in a garage, people who are pretty clueless, right? The name of the game with app stores was to make it as easy as possible for developers to develop apps so that you could grow the ecosystem. And because we would have all these apps, people would say, my goodness, I've got to have one of those smartphones because there are so many apps there, and surely there's a combination of these apps that's going to be just very valuable to me. But it's not the same combination for everyone, which is why you want to have all these apps. So you've got all these developers, and whether it's iOS, right, Apple, or Android, Google, they've made sure that it's super easy for a developer to access a ton of sensitive information. So you've got all these APIs and things that used to take several weeks.
While many websites offer
Okay, that will be the video. Feel free to play it. And
users choices to opt out of some of their data collection and use practices, most of these choices are buried deep in the text of long, jargon-filled privacy policies and are never seen by users. Different privacy regulations grant users the right to opt out of practices relying on the collection and use of their data. This includes the right to opt out of having one's data shared with third parties for different purposes, the right to opt out of receiving marketing emails, the right to opt out of cookies, and more. But as it stands, most websites don't offer easy and practical access to these choices, effectively depriving users of their rights. To help make opt-out choices more accessible to users, a team of researchers from Carnegie Mellon University has developed a browser extension called Opt-out Easy, which uses machine learning technology to automatically find opt-out choices for users as they browse from one website to another. Opt-out Easy is available to both Chrome and Firefox users. By clicking on the extension's icon, users are presented with opt-out links found in the privacy policy of the website that they are currently visiting, allowing them to, for example, opt out of analytics or limit marketing emails. Start practicing your right to privacy with Opt-out Easy.
And obviously, we've got good marketing people at CMU, so they come up with these nice videos about the work that we do. But going back to something else that we've done in this space, we've said, well, if we can read the text of privacy policies, and if we also have technology that can look at the code, for instance, of mobile apps and the behavior of mobile app, perhaps we can identify automatically discrepancies between what the privacy policy says and what the app actually does. And as I've mentioned, app developers are pretty clueless, and before you know it, there are actually a ton of those issues. And so we developed technology that compares those two sides of things, the disclosures that are being made by app developers and the behavior of their apps. And again, that's a space that we've pioneered, sort of looking at these two things. And obviously, if what you are doing is not consistent with what you're saying, then under most privacy laws, all privacy laws, these discrepancies amount to compliance issues. And you can actually find all sorts of other things along the way. When you start looking at the code of apps, you find that they're sending your location unencrypted, which they should never do, and all sorts of things of that nature. So we scaled this tool. At some point, we actually automatically analyzed over 1 million apps, and we found that over 600,000 of these apps had compliance issues. On average, we're finding more than 3 compliance issues per app. And you might say, okay, that sounds great. How does this compare with what regulatory agencies are able to do? So back in 2014, the main regulatory agencies around the world, they come together around Privacy Day, and they've got conferences. They decide to join forces and see whether they could actually manually analyze mobile apps. And they had about 50 people, like the best people, to do these sorts of things. They worked collectively for a week analyzing mobile apps. And can you guess how many apps they were able to analyze? They did a wonderful job. They analyzed 1,000 apps. We're able to analyze basically the whole app store in a matter of a day or so. So this is analysis where you automatically look at the code, you decompile the code, you do all sorts of other things I don't have the time to tell you about, and you look at the privacy policies and you find discrepancies. And so obviously we approach the regulators and say, hey, we've got this tool, we did this analysis, is this of interest? And I said, that's really very much of interest, but obviously we need to manually vet everything that you do using machine learning techniques. We're not going to start suing people, right, and slapping them with fines unless we vetted things. And we're very, very thin as far as manpower is concerned. So can you narrow it down to 10? So we took the 600,000 and we said, what sort of criteria would you like? And we discussed various criteria. I don't need to go into the details. We gave them the list of 10, and they were very happy, and they went after various people who should not have been doing these sorts of things. If I had more time, I would tell you also what sorts of things trips app developers most of the time. Third-party libraries are a big part of that problem, but I don't have the time to dwell on that. So these technologies today are part of a tool that Google has developed and makes available to app developers. It's called Google Checks. It's directly based on these technologies that we've developed, so that's another example of something that we've done in that space. If I had more time, I would continue talking about these things. But beyond the fact that people don't read the text of privacy policy, we've also taken a very different line of approach. And we've said, well, at the end of the day, privacy policies today are maybe 5, 6, 7 pages, sometimes even more. Nobody reads them. But do people really care about every single line of text in these privacy policies? The answer is no. Most of the time, people care about a subset of issues, actually a relatively narrow set of issues. And so something that we've been advocating over the years was the introduction of privacy labels. Just like you have nutrition labels for your food, you look at your box of cereal, there are 5 or 6 things, perhaps 10 things that are reported. You look for the one thing that matters to you. Perhaps you're allergic to nuts. Perhaps you care about saturated fat, whatever it might be. You find that information in no time. So the question is, could you do the same thing for privacy policies? And so this is work I did with my colleague, Laurie Craner. She pioneered this concept in general, but we focused in particular on mobile apps with a PhD student that we're co-advising, Patrick Kelly, who happens to work for Google right now. And we developed these privacy labels, and we said, hey, here's the research. These things really can make a difference. And for about 6 years, nobody did anything about it. But one day, Apple gave us a call and said, later this month, we're announcing that we're adopting your privacy labels, and we're launching that. And surely enough, 6 months later, Google called us and said, we're doing that too. They're calling them a bit differently, but that's what they're doing. So are they doing a great job with these privacy labels? They're not. Actually, we've written more papers showing that what they did was not the best. I don't have the time to cover all these things in detail, but this is certainly a form of accomplishment, and some of you might have seen these privacy labels. But we can't help. We're researchers, and so we can't help to be skeptical about what people do. And so we wanted to see how these labels compared with the questions that people actually have. And so we ran a study where we collected a lot of questions from people to see what sorts of issues they cared about when it came to privacy. And the answer was that these labels, they're not terrible, but they don't even answer 50% of the questions that people have. So people have actually relatively diverse questions that go beyond those labels. And those labels, one of our other criticisms is that they're already too complex, as it turns out. And so I'm not going to do a show of hands on this, but probably most of you are not looking at them. I'm just going to guess. Maybe you didn't even know they existed until today, and maybe you're going to look tomorrow. And so as a result, another line of research that we've engaged in, and I'm one of those people who've been working, I've been trained as an AI person, even though I work in privacy and security. And so for the past 20 years, I've been telling people that if we're going to make a difference in privacy and align what people really need when it comes to privacy with what's available, we're going to need AI, like the kinds of things that I've talked about, the ability to automatically understand the text of privacy policies. And so it's very natural to say, okay, well, if the labels don't do a sufficient job, could we somehow build an assistant that would just answer people's questions, right? And now you're clearly thinking about your typical chatbot. We started this work before LLMs. We're using LLMs too these days. But as it turns out, and I don't have the time to really dwell on this, one of the things that quickly came clear is that these LLMs, as they exist in their current form, fall a little short. And so that's because privacy policies are written by lawyers, and they're using terms that are not always very easy to understand, even by very sophisticated LLMs. They're using concepts such as, so for instance, if someone says, is this app collecting any information about my health? And this is an app, for instance, that discloses the fact that it's collecting information about how you commute between work and home. And one of the options, perhaps there's like 5 options, one of these options is I'm biking or I'm walking. That can actually be viewed as collecting a form of information that has to do with your health. So there are lots of examples like that. LLMs really struggle with these kinds of things. But the most important area where LLMs really, really fall short has to do with the fact that the very same question does not admit the same answer depending on which jurisdiction you're in. So for instance, if you're in California and you say, does this app share my location with advertisers? Under California law, CCPA is the name of the law, you have to disclose that in your privacy policy. If you're in Pennsylvania, you don't. And so the very same privacy policy, right, doesn't necessarily mean the same thing, depending on where you are. And so there's a need also to train these LLMs. Today, they're completely oblivious to these kinds of issues. And so that's another thing that we've done. You might say, well, is that very common? You wouldn't believe how often privacy policies are silent. These colors are supposed to tell you how often they're silent about different kinds of questions. And again, I'm sort of going a little fast because I've got a little less time, but that should give you a sense for the flavor. I've got 2 minutes left. Okay, in that case, let's quickly accelerate. So we've also done a lot of work to address the the fact that nobody has the time to configure all these privacy settings. And this has involved using something called nudging. So we've been extremely successful with nudges. And this is the idea that as we discussed at the beginning, privacy just as security are secondary tasks. So people tend to just focus on their primary tasks. They ignore everything. But when you tell someone that apps on their phones have collected their location 5,398 times, somehow you get their attention. And you get them to actually review those settings that most of you don't seem to be reviewing very often. And so the concept of nudging that we've explored, and we've done a lot of work in this space, is one where we explore different types of theory. For instance, one example of a theory that's extremely relevant is called protection motivation theory. It's about highlighting risks, right? Like, for instance, when this kid crosses the street, maybe you should say, hey, you better look left and right because you might get run over. That might prompt them to stop looking at the social media. When you tell someone their location has been shared 5,398 times, that makes a big difference. So I don't have the time to go again into lots of details, but those technologies have also been adopted. So Apple has introduced this in iOS 13. You might actually have seen these screens. And so that's also been very effective. We've also developed technology that learns people's privacy preferences. I don't have the time to discuss that in lots of details. It's not about taking over, because privacy is about retaining agency, remaining in control. So it's not that we want the machine learning to configure your privacy settings. But one of the things I've done in my work over the years is showed that there are very, very strong correlations between how people feel about many different types of scenarios. And so if you group people who are like-minded into clusters, you can actually infer many of their likely preferences, and you can come up with recommendations. And so we had an app actually in the Google Play Store for many years that was available for people with the rooted Android phones. And so that was also very successful. Google actually implemented this too. They tested it. It worked fantastic until somebody reminded them that because of this tool, now everybody was opting out, and that might not be very good for their business model. So that was not deployed, but they've actually implemented this technology in the context of Chrome extensions. I don't have the time to talk about the Internet of Things, but we've done things in that space in the context of smart cities, and there's a lot more I would love to tell you. But let me spend perhaps the last minute telling you about what we've done in the space of security, right? So one of the big challenges I mentioned in security is that many of the problems, many of the incidents that occur have to do with people just not doing the right thing. And so one way of trying to diminish that is to get people to take the training. Most of the time, training has been highly ineffective, and nobody has taken it. We basically pioneered nudging techniques to get people to take the training. So you probably know what we're doing, because this has become the standard today. We came up with this idea that if you're going to tell someone, for instance, to take some training on how to detect a phishing email, the most effective way of doing that is to send a fake phishing email in their inbox. And when they fall for it, right, they realize there's no argument anymore that they clearly don't know something, and that they should really, take a look at the training content, perhaps spend 5 minutes learning how they could protect themselves against those kinds of attacks. And so that was the basis for a company that I started in 2008. As I've mentioned, that company has basically built on top of research at Carnegie Mellon. We developed a whole suite of products that adopted these principles, developed also email filtering techniques. I grew the company for 10 years, sold it for about $250 million to a company called Proofpoint. And that company itself got acquired for $12 billion. We contribute to about 25% of the revenue of that company. And today, that's a multi-billion-dollar market, obviously. So that's been fun, and I think I've probably run out of time. So hopefully this was interesting. What I was trying to show you is how you can basically, I could talk more about security assistants we've developed that are also using the same principles to get people to do the right thing. But hopefully this was interesting. So a lot of our work really attempts to bridge the gap between, for instance, what privacy regulations assume people can do and what people can actually do in practice. And it also attempts to overcome the fact that in security, people are often the weakest link, and they need also tools to help them so that you end up being in a better posture as a company. And so I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. I think he deserves a very special hand. I know very few speakers who can move that fast through their slide deck, know what's coming, and still be intelligible. And
well, thank you.
I thank you very much. That was very clear and very interesting. And boy, I wish we'd had about 3 hours with you.
Well,
So-
I'll have to come back
So
then.
you definitely have to come back. Thank you again, and if you will indulge us in a few picture ops, we
Oh,
can
sure.
have a token.
Oh, wow. I should come more often.
You should come more often. I think the photographer wants to stand in the middle here. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, slide.